Okay, committee, it's 6:30, so we'll start proceedings with the fire evacuation procedures. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exits are located at the rear and side of this room. Go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. And next, to note that the open proceedings of the meeting are webcast. Next, to ask that mobiles are switched off or put on silent. Excuse me. Thank you. And to receive apologies for absence, I've got formal apologies from Councillor Terry Reid, Councillor Mark Raffel and Councillor Colin Regan. Any more? No? Okay. No resignations and replacements that I know of. Any conflicts of interest from anybody? No. No urgent items. To confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 27th of March 2013, which can be found at paper A. Are we agreed on those? Yes, thank you. I'll sign those at the end. We obviously don't have any member or public participation that I can see. Where I have no referrals from other committees, the council or cabinet. Report from the portfolio holder. Do you want to say anything at this stage? No? Okay. So we can move straight on to the main business of the agenda, which is the new draft statement of licensing policy under the Licensing Act 2003, which is the act that deals chiefly with alcohol and regulated entertainment. That's at paper B. You'll note, I'm sure you've all read it from cover to cover, that this isn't just a reworking of the old one with tweaks, but this is a whole new policy, considerably longer than the original one, much more comprehensive, much more helpful. And so our role is to look at it with a broad view and see if it contains everything that we'd like it to have, which is going to help us with our decision making, etc. And also quite a lot of it is for the licensing team themselves to have the smooth running of their department. So first of all, before I sort of say how we'll go through it, I'll ask Linda to introduce it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. Forgive me if I refer to my notes, but I've written quite a bit down tonight because there's quite a lot to say. As Councillor Mrs Taylor expanded, it is a rather large policy. It was almost 3 years ago that a decision was made to carry out a review of the licensing policy, and at that time we had intended to do the full review then. But in view of the impending changes to the Licensing Act due to a change in government, which brought about other legislation such as the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act, which finally became law last year, a reduced review was carried out to meet our statutory obligations, because at that time we had to review the policy every 3 years. So that was in 2011. Since then, those legislative changes have been implemented, and there's been some additional new legislation, such as the Live Music Act, which impacts on the licensing of live music, and also the deregulation of parts of Schedule 1 of the Licensing Act in relation to some of the regulated entertainment activities. Officers have implemented those changes, and we've considered the impacts of those on our policy. In addition to that, the nighttime economy has changed in recent years, I'm sure you'll agree, and there's been a trend towards later closing times within the town centre especially. The current policy doesn't specifically set out this council's approach to licensing of much later hours. The existing policy, although it has served reasonably well in recent years, it's quite generic in its approach, and officers believe strongly that this council's statement of licensing policy should be to relate directly to the borough of Basingstoke-Dean. The existing policy has supported members in their decision making and provided information for proposed and existing applicants. But we feel that as time has progressed, we need a more directional policy to further support that decision making process in line with the council's aspirations for this borough. We believe it should clearly set out the Basingstoke-Dean approach to licensing and to ensure the promotion of all the licensing objectives. As the Chairman said, you will see that this is a brand new licensing policy for Basingstoke-Dean. We've almost ripped up the old and started from scratch, which is why you don't have a document showing any track changes. This new policy demonstrates more clearly links to other council initiatives and the council plan to ensure a cohesive and joined up approach. It is also aspirational by looking beyond the statutory 5-year time frame and considering this town in 10 or 20 years in line with the central area vision. In drafting this policy for consultation, officers have referred to the best framework guidance for the review of licensing policies issued by the Local Government Association. We've looked at Basingstoke Council strategies and considered the impacts of the legislative changes, and we've also looked at other policies of other councils, particularly those within our family group. We have considered how our own Licensing Act hearings have functioned over recent years, and also how this new policy may further support the decision-making process for both members and applicants. We have considered the quality of the applications and the understanding and knowledge of applicants, and feel that more detail in this policy will provide the necessary assistance to enable them to submit quality applications that are in line with the aspiration of this authority. Section 5 of the report summarises the preparation that has been undertaken to formulate this draft policy, and I've summarised the major changes to the policy at section 6 of the report, and I apologise for the two spelling mistakes at section 6. There's been a shift to ensure that we balance the protection of the community with the ability for well-managed businesses to thrive and support our economy. At the same time, it encourages diversity and choice, including non-alcohol-led premises. It sets out how the council can support applicants with pre-application advice within reason, but we expect applicants to be the expert in their businesses and submit quality applications that are relevant to their business they are operating or propose to operate. I've strengthened and expanded the wording in relation to supermarkets and other off-licences in respect of underage sales, the mandatory conditions, proxy sales, and in particular sales to customers with obvious alcohol-related health issues. You'll be aware that the Health Authority is now a statutory consultee, but we didn't go as far as Scotland and include a licensing objective that promotes public health. So I wanted just to ensure that we had those links to health within the policy. And I think ill health through alcohol is a very important issue that our licensees need to be aware of. There is more detail on the DPS role as well, and our approach to DPS being nominated at more than one premises. Sometimes this has caused problems where you've got busy premises and you've got one nominated person technically responsible for more than one busy premises. The Licensing Act's quite silent on the role of the DPS. So we felt that it was useful to have an approach where if people are going to be designated at more than one premises, that we are satisfied, or more the police are, that they can manage those premises well and promote the objectives by doing so. So I've added a little extra in there. But as with all applications, they will be treated on their individual merits, and the police will object if there is consider there is a risk to the promotion of the crime and disorder objective. I've referred to the late night levy and the MRO to give us the flexibility within this policy to change our approach. We did bring those matters to this committee a while back, and at that time it was agreed that it wasn't relevant to this borough at that time. But I have included that within the policy, and also suggested that should it change and we decide to implement a late night levy, that we should be agreeing with the police in advance as to how their allocation of the income to the levy should be spent, and almost require it to be spent in our borough. It's not a lawful requirement, but I think as an authority we want to see that money come back to this borough. There's a bit extra on the cumulative impact option, which again we don't have that, but it could be something that needs to be considered in the future. Now that the licensing authority is also a responsible authority, I've detailed our approach to that role to ensure that it is clear and that it will be undertaken fairly and correctly. It is important also to recognise that this borough is very rural in nature. An approach to licensing in a busy nighttime economy area such as the town centre will not be suitable for the rural villages. Hence the reflection of that. The policy pays attention to closing times and the desire to ensure a balance between the business trading needs and the needs of local residents to enjoy their homes without harm or nuisance, particularly in the villages. I think it's important to ensure that the policy also reflects the impact of local housing developments close to licensed premises, and how through licensing the two can coexist successfully without problems, particularly in relation to the new homes being constructed close to Winchester Street, London Street and Woke Street. The central area vision for the town has direct links with licensing, and it's anticipated that area of regeneration will draw in all types of businesses, many that will need to be licensed. This policy needs to support that regeneration and ensure that the businesses moving in do not cause detriment to the area or nearby residents, but support and improve the economy. Our recent success in achieving the Purple Flag Award will hopefully encourage more new businesses to the town centre. And the proposed regeneration of the top of the town will also attract a range of businesses offers that can trade side by side whether licensed or not. The policy does seek to encourage diversity and a range of choice. It acknowledges that this committee expects an appropriate amount of enforcement and inspection of licensed premises to be undertaken by the licensing team, and how this is to be achieved is detailed in the policy. We already have excellent joint working in place with the licensing police and the town centre police to ensure a partnership approach to enforcement, and this will be maintained. I have included how we will approach our new powers to suspend licences where the annual fee remains unpaid after the necessary deadline. This was something else that came in recently, last year. It's quite a good deterrent as well. People do tend to pay if they think they're going to have their licences suspended. You will then see at Part B of the policy more information for applicants and the public on the Council's approach to its consideration of the different types of licences. I have included additional information on the licensing of clubs to ensure that those businesses remember their unique position in relation to licensing, and also the restrictions placed on them in relation to providing licensable activities to non-members. We have had cause to carry out some enforcement on clubs and felt that more detail in the policy would assist in compliance. We've seen a slight increase in reviews of licences and have therefore expanded information to all parties on that process, as well as an expectation of applicants to provide an acceptable level of evidence to support why a review is necessary, and so as to avoid frivolous applications. We also consider mediation to be a useful tool, hence it's mentioned in the policy. I've expanded in the policy on licence conditions in respect of each of the 4 licensing objectives, and this section encourages businesses to look more closely at what steps they need to take to promote the licensing objectives to avoid the need for the subcommittees to impose sanctions at a hearing. I've also included a more detailed section on temporary events to reflect those legislative changes and the new late temporary event. You'll be aware that there are now 2 types of temporary event notice, some of which can be rejected if they're late and some can't, etc. So I've included that in there in the detail. Following the implementation of the European Services Directive in 2009, which required all councils to make certain application types available online to assist members of European states to apply, I've included our policy on managing those applications, particularly as the online application process is outside our control. It's hosted by the gov.uk website, and this has delayed applications when the online facility is not available. So I've made it quite clear how to go about that in the policy. The policy also includes reference and guidance at section 28 on other activities that may take place at licensed premises that were not previously included, for example gaming machines, tables and chairs licences, and entertainment of an adult nature. The policy includes references and guidance on those other activities to ensure a cohesive approach to licensing, so that when people do make applications they can understand that, if they need a table and chairs outside, that needs a licence, and it's trying to bring all those activities that take place at licensed premises together. A bit of a snapshot of the draft policy, considering its length, but I hope you'll agree that it is a policy for Basingstoke and Deane and sets out our stall as to how we want our borough to look and feel in relation to licensing, and that it's not time limited. But in view of the constant changes to the relevant legislation, you will see the second recommendation of the report is to authorise the Head of Governance to approve non-contentious changes to the policy as necessary to ensure it keeps up to date with the legislation. Any contentious changes will of course be brought back to this committee for consideration. Hope that helps, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody want to ask questions at this stage about the broad principle of the review, the policy, and the way in which it's come about? We will be going through it section by section, so obviously you have plenty of chance to ask questions on specifics. Okay, I mean, normally we would have the particular areas that have been amended and adjusted, and we would probably just have looked at those at this committee, but because obviously it is, as Linda has explained, a complete reworking of our policy, we will just go through it section by section, and we'll give opportunity for you to ask questions and to make comments or suggestions as we go through. Obviously not expecting you to have anything to say about a lot of it, because a lot of it is fairly standard and won't greatly concern us, but there are some areas which do concern us as a committee quite seriously, and it would be nice to have some discussion points there. So if you'd like to work through it with me, we will start at, let's see, page 7, I think probably is the first general area. If we look at the first sections, that's paragraphs, chapters 2, 3 and 4, that's the kind of preamble section. Does anybody have any comments to make about those? Any questions or comments about background, scope, and links to other council strategies? No? Yes? Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. Just before we start to go through it, can I just check which numbers we're referring to when we're going through the paper, because you've got two sets of numbers, and I'd just like to be clear which...
We're on 7 of 42.
7 of 42.
Well, I've actually written it down, I have to confess, on my notes as the bottom page, at the bottom of the page, which is a number of 42. So if you could look at the one at the centre, at the bottom, I'll be referring to that and to the number of the section, so it would be the numbered paragraphs.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's the first 4 sections. Next we look at then section 5 on pages 10 and 11 of 42. That's the policy aims. Any questions or comments on the aims? No? I'll give you a bit of time just to refresh your memories about what it's all about. If I could just make a slight suggestion, the actual vision statement was at section 5.1 was partly my suggestion, I believe. Could I just suggest that it's slightly differently worded? It reads a little strange to me at the moment. Don't know if it does to you. My suggestion for rewording is this: take it or leave it, but this is it. The vision: to establish in the borough a wide choice of high quality and responsibly managed entertainment and cultural venues, which provide a diverse range of licensed activities, community interaction, and a variety of places for retail and refreshment, ensuring at all times the safety and amenity of residential communities, business communities, and the visiting public. It says the same thing in a slightly more elegant way, I think. Does that sound okay? Are we all happy with that? Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you, everyone. If there's no other comment on section 5, we'll go on to general considerations, which is on page 12 to 15 of 42. Section 6, so these are all the paragraphs, 6 point whatever. Give you a chance to look at them. Yes, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. Section 6.19 on page 14 of 42. Licensing and planning and permission. It refers to the licensing authority having an expectation that certain things will be in place. And then it says that the licensing authority recognises that there is no legal basis for refusing a license application in the absence of any planning permission. However, all applicants will be expected to be in possession of the necessary planning authority. And my question is, but if it hasn't, what? If you've no authority to enforce any change, if it hasn't got it, how do we make them do it?
Yes, because they don't have to have the planning permission to get the licence, because often they'll apply for the licence before the planning permission, or the other way around, just to be sure they can get it. We're just setting out an expectation here that whilst we can't enforce it, we would expect you to have gone through the necessary channels to obtain the appropriate authorisations across all areas, and we would generally make sure that they were aware that they needed the planning permission, either in writing or through the pre-application advice stage or whatever. It would come up.
But there's nothing that says you have to have this, and if you don't have it, there aren't any consequences of that not being the case. We can say we expect you to have it, but if they don't have it, nothing changes.
Other than the strong arm of the planning enforcement team.
That's what I was hoping you were going to say, but how would you strong-arm somebody then? How would that happen? I'm just thinking, I'm not challenging, I'm just asking, well, in practice, how would that work if there was a circumstance where an applicant didn't have everything in place? What do we do to encourage them to meet the standards that we're trying to set?
The planners are a statutory consultee as well, so it will be brought to their attention anyway. And we would say to them, we're aware you haven't got planning permission. You will need to do this. We can't enforce it under the Licensing Act, but if you don't get it, you will receive the wrath of the planning team. And as they're a statutory consultee, they will already have it on their system, and it should hopefully flag up something in their department to say, well, they've applied for a licence, but with no planning authority, and and that has happened. It has happened. The two do work quite well together.
The Roth is a persuasive tool, is it? Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Godison.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to raise the same point, but I would like to see it a bit stronger there, because I would suggest that if we issue a licence to a premises which does not have planning permission for that sort of activity, then we're almost acquiescing in an illegal act. I mean, is it not possible for us to say that they must get planning permission and then we'll consider the licence?
There are no grounds under the Licensing Act to refuse an application if they haven't got planning permission. So, no, can't.
Councillor Frankham.
First one is on 6.8, with customers that appear to have health issues. I know some people that get very embarrassed. They have health issues that don't stop them from alcohol, but do give the appearance they might already be intoxicated, and they get very embarrassed. So I don't want it changed, but some guidance for people, because I have seen that happen. For instance, my dad had brain surgery, and for 5 years afterwards, he looked like he was drunk all the time. He wasn't. He just had a balance problem because of the surgery. And on 6.9, makes I think that's the one. Reasonable steps on the internet. Well, the other technology at the moment is used only by the chains is automated tills. But if smaller shops start doing it, I would like something to be mentioned around the checks that happen in the chain stores as well, where if you try and buy alcohol, it pages someone to confirm it. Because we did have a problem in the past with the Tesco's in town, where that's how the underage people getting the drinks and just using automated tills because they weren't being checked. Two on that.
She's noted both of those, so thank you very much. Anybody else want to make any comments on that particular section 6? Yes, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. I think Councillor Frankham makes a really good point, and I'd highlighted 6.8 and 6.9 as well, in terms of how will that actually happen, and what is there an expectation that the licensee will have a level of training that would enable people to distinguish between people who are under the influence of alcohol but have speech impediments or have mental health issues, and you need to avoid penalising or discriminating people who are legitimately buying alcohol, and maybe somebody on the counter is going to say, well, I think you're drunk, and they're not at all.
In response to that paragraph was particularly aimed at street drinkers, for want of a better expression, but I didn't want to put the word street drinkers in the policy. So I think I probably need to explore the wording of that to reflect those concerns, because it really was aimed at the guys and ladies potentially, who do drink in the street and frequent certain premises to buy the low-cost cider and that sort of thing. So we were sort of aiming it at that, really. But I'm very happy to review that paragraph in reflection of the comments that have been made.
Thank you, good points. Is there anything else that you want to raise in section 6? No? Okay, thank you. We'll move on then to section 7, which is about responsible authorities and other persons. Any questions or comments or points to be raised in that section? good. Oh, Councillor Taylor. No, that's also good.
Oh, just to emphasise the point on 7.9, Mrs. Cannon has already made the reference to that inclusion, and I think that's an excellent step. Just to make that point, thank you.
Yeah, that's agreed. Okay, section 8 on page 17 of 42, the approach to licensing in the town centre. You will notice that this is considerably different. Councillor Godison.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just interested in 8.3. The top of town currently contains several alcohol-led premises that trade until 3 or 4 a.m. and then further down it says, however, a presumption would be made to grant hours no later than between 12 and 2. How's that going to sit with those premises which already have license to 3 or 4 till 3 or 4, and would the fact that there are some premises which have licenses later allow somebody to whom we're only giving a license till, say, 1 to appeal, saying it's being discriminated against because other premises within the vicinity have licenses until much later? Thank you.
The aim of that was really to support the staggered closing times. Clearly, we've had a general creep of premises opening later and later. As a result of the policy, we couldn't rein those back in unless they were subject to review through reasons of crime disorder or related reasons. So we couldn't suddenly say to two of the bars, sorry, we're changing your hours to 2. But because we have suggested a more staggered approach to allow people to get home more regularly and so the whole town doesn't empty at the same time, we're saying that there would be a presumption that the hours would be reined in to support the staggered closing times. We may get away with it, we may not. It really depends on if they appeal and on what grounds. But at least we're giving them an indication that we are looking at reining in the hours. And clearly, if some other premises currently open till 1 want to vary, then there is an understanding that there's a presumption that we may not allow it because we think we've probably got enough, not that we can have a cumulative impact policy unofficially. But it's really just to say that we're wanting to bring those hours back. We acknowledge that those premises that have already got them, we can't change unless it's reviewed. But anybody else coming in new would look at that and think, oh, well, I might not get those late hours because of their staggered closing time policy. Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand what you're saying, but if this committee is of the view that 2 a.m. is late enough to have any license at the top of town, would it be helpful, assuming that this draft policy is accepted, to indicate to those people who have licenses to 3 or 4 that when they come up for review, they may be pulled back to an earlier time?
That already is an option to the licensing subcommittee. When a licence comes up for review, they can amend the hours, amend the conditions. So I think licence holders are fully aware that if their premises licence comes up for review because they've not been complying, the chances are there will be a change, albeit by conditioning, changing the hours, taking away activities. So that opportunity is open to the subcommittee for all of the review applications anyway, depending on the nature of the reasons for the review.
Quick supplement. So what you're suggesting is that one would only be able to review it if they're not complying. I mean, what I'm asking is if a premises currently has a license till 4 o'clock, but there's no necessary disturbance involving the police occurring, it may still be the wish of this committee that we ought to be pulling the hours back a bit. Does legal hold the view that would be a permissible thing to do, even if there weren't any trouble with it, or would that be open to appeal to the magistrates on? Anyway, yeah.
Unfortunately, I concur with comments that Linda said. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to do it. It's something that the licence holders already are aware that when it comes to review, it's within the remits that the hours could be changed at that time. So unfortunately, it's not something that we can do.
I mean, I think the hope is that by doing this, we are starting to create a different culture in the town, so that it almost comes automatically that all clubs don't expect to be open until 4 o'clock in the morning. Councillor Taylor first, and then Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. And it's the same point as Fen was making. Just thinking about the angle from an appeal point of view, if we refuse, for example, if we refuse somebody a licence beyond 2 a.m., what's our view as a licensing authority of the prospect of an appeal being lodged because there's a differential, there's some discrimination there. Well, here you've got premises licensed till 3 and 4, you're not letting us do that, so we're going to appeal on the grounds of precedence. There's going to be a cost implication potentially for appeals and the cost against this licensing authority. I just wonder what your view was.
My view would be that we have always considered, this authority has always considered staggered closing times to be an effective way of dispersing people home. It takes the pressure off the transport that's available. It takes the pressure off the policing because people are coming out and going home at different times. So that's in the policy. So that could be used to support the decision that you could say, well, we've got 2 premises in that area already open till 4. So we think that to relieve the pressure and to support our policy of staggered closing times, we're only going to let you have 2 or 3 o'clock. And then that would be the reasoning behind your decision, which would appear in the decision notice. And then it would be for the magistrate, if they appeal, it would be for the magistrates to decide, were you wrong in making that decision? And if you've got a robust policy behind you and evidence to support that there is a range of staggered closing times, then magistrates may well decide that that was the right decision.
Yeah, I think that's really coherent in terms of how it would fit. It fits with the vision, the policy, and so on. So as long as we're very clear that we may well get that, but if we can, if our defence, if you like, against that differential is, well, we're trying to promote a policy of staggered closing time, that makes absolute sense and quite right. And over time, maybe other licences will come into line. But as long as we're confident that we can defend that policy in relation to an appeal and a challenge, because we're treating people differently.
I think it's also relevant that we are increasing the residential capacity in that part of town. We're building the McCarthy and Stone retirement homes, and they are very close to a lot of these premises. So I think that also gives us an extra reason for targeting the top of town, and it is mentioned in here. Councillor Jones.
Most of it's been covered, but the point actually is just what you raised, that by having these late hours, how do we monitor in as much as people leaving the town? And my concern would be, we don't want everybody leaving at the same time. But if noise continues, not just in the town area, on the estates when they're coming home, till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, because, how does that get monitored? Because we can't put it down to one premises. And that's the concern I have, is that everybody wants that freedom to go about their business, but it does affect people the later or the earlier hours of the morning. But if you've got that, say, from 12 o'clock till 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning at different sections, people walking through the estates, walking through the town, the retirement homes, how are we going to monitor the noise issue, and where do we draw the line with which premises we say is enough's enough? Does that make sense?
The Licensing Act is quite clear, and there's been recent case law that says licensees are only responsible for their premises and anything that they have control of. So we couldn't use the Licensing Act as a tool to reduce nuisance out at Winklebury or Oakridge, because, like you say, you don't know which premises it's linked to. It could be linked to parties on the estates or whatever. So we can't use the Licensing Act as a tool to control activities or nuisance beyond the direct control of the licensees. So we wouldn't be able to do that under the Act.
Because later on, when we're talking about rural areas, we're saying the exact opposite. The way I read it was, we don't want something opening late because it affects people. My concern is it affects people in the town area as well. I don't know, I haven't got the answer, but see where I'm coming from.
I think the difference in rural areas is just generally most villages have their local pub, so you can identify that the nuisance could be coming from a particular premises, and if it's within the vicinity, or not shouldn't use that word anymore, but if it's close enough to the village pub for the licensee to be able to control it, then you could make sanctions under the Act. But obviously when people are coming home from all areas of the town, we might have people getting back to Southam who've been for a drink at Winkerbury or at Buckskin or somewhere else. So it would be, and the licensing act is very clear that it's only what's in the control of the licensee, but I take the point.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to go back to 8.3. Can I just ask for a clarification? Is it the intention of the borough that no new licences are to be granted after 2 a.m.? Because if that is the wish and the intention, then a presumption will be made is a phrase that a lawyer can shoot full of holes. We need to get rid of the word presumption if it's the intention that there are no more new licences after 2 a.m. Sorry.
You can't say never under the Licensing Act. It's very much each case on its merits. So if an application came in for a 4 a.m. closure that was a good quality application, it set out lots of statements that would be conditions as to how they were going to control their business, how they were going to promote the licensing objectives, and how they were, there was nothing in it that stated that would give us this authority cause for concern, then you would find, apart from using the policy of the staggered closing, you would have little reason to refuse it, but you could refuse it or reduce it based on the policy. It's one of those situations where we can't say never, because the Act is very clear that each application must be considered on its individual merits. But as members on a subcommittee, having considered it on its individual merits, may still decide that it is appropriate to restrict the hours based on our policy. That is for you to decide at the subcommittee hearing. And as I said earlier, if you give good reasons and use the policy to support those decisions, it should stand up in a magistrate's court.
Sorry, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's going back to Councillor Jones's point about the limitations of the Licensing Act, and you make a reference in the policy about how that relates to environmental health, and maybe there's other legislation that could address the issues beyond what we would expect a licensee to be responsible for. I suppose residents would be looking for for us to be able to demonstrate quite a tight connection between the Licensing Act, the licensing authority, and the environmental health elements of the local authority. And how would we make sure that, if a situation like Councillor Jones came up, and it will do, how are we going to demonstrate and reassure residents that, okay, we're sorry, the Licensing Act doesn't cover it, we can't do anything about that, but there is another way we could approach it, and we've got a pretty robust arrangement to bring that in, should that be needed. How do we go about that?
Well, as I've mentioned in relation to the Live Music Act, because there's been a reduction in the restrictions on that, we've made it clear that we would still expect people, although live music won't be licensed up to 11 o'clock in certain circumstances, we've said that we've still got the Environmental Protection Act, which can protect residents if people still cause a nuisance from their unregulated live music. And the same would apply in a locality where people were coming back making a noise. I think the difficulty would be proving who's making the noise, why they're making the noise, and it would be for the environmental health team to investigate that and try and identify it through the Environmental Protection Act channels. And as we said earlier, if you had 10 people making a racket going through Buckskin or somewhere at night, how you would ever find them to identify where they'd been drinking and that sort of thing, is almost impossible. But if you've got a crowd of people that regularly cause a nuisance in a locality, the Environmental Protection Act can be used to deal with that, and people are able to complain through the 101 system, through the website, and for environmental health to investigate. So there are steps and measures that can be used. It's just pinpointing it, which is outside the role of the Licensing Act in terms of the localities away from the premises.
And this policy signposts people down that route if they're in a position where we can't cover their problem, we can't deal with it. We say it in here, don't we? That problem could be addressed through different legislation or different department. So that's what I'm just wanting to make sure that we've got a tight profile. Probably
not in as much detail as you're highlighting, but I can tweak that to raise awareness about other noise issues unrelated to perhaps the live music that's occurring that's now not licensed. So I can actually add a paragraph in there that when neighbour noise occurs, they still have the option of going to the local authority environmental health department.
I'm thumping this point because my father-in-law is about to move into McCarthy Stone and I will get so much grief.
Direction of interest there then. Are we talking about the Basingstoke one?
Say no more, Chairman.
Are we generally agreed that we do welcome this as a starting point, at least, for reining in the closing times in Basingstoke, which have got quite ridiculous, have they not? Could I therefore raise a point myself? First of all, could we have a title above 8.2 saying top of town? Because farther down at 8.4, it isn't quite clear that we're still talking about the top of town. We've got actually four sections to do with the top of town that need to be clustered, at the top of 8.2. If I could just quickly make my point, Councillor Jones, it is just simply that this is wonderful that we've made a start at the top of town, but I'm also very aware that at the other side of town we have still got very late closing, and we've also got residents probably even closer to them. And I really just want to ask the question, would there be anything to stop us from actually having a similar recommendation, or perhaps 3 a.m. or something, to make sure that there's a staggering going on for premises that aren't in the top of town, but are either farther into town? I know there's at least one at the bottom of Woke Street, or over the other side of town, which are also close to residences and do actually cause quite a lot of disturbance. Is there anything we can do to broaden it slightly so that we're talking about the whole of the area and not just the top of town?
I think I could add in a paragraph to say although we've highlighted Winchester Road, Winchester Street, London Street, we could put another paragraph in about generally where noise licensed premises are close to residents. We can expand on that, so it's not just. So we've highlighted the top of town particularly because there's new development going on and the town centre regeneration is likely to attract more businesses. But I can add another paragraph about generally premises being close to residents and how we would look at managing those hours. Where would you want me to put that? Because it needs to be probably.
I think it can probably be under, just after that, under the general title of closing times. You've got a 8.6, haven't you?
I'll add it in there.
And we could say something like where premises are particularly close to residential accommodation, an earlier closing time may be required if it's considered that the licensing objective has not been adequately promoted, or something like that. We can work with that. Is everyone happy with that we try and broaden it to the rest of town as well, so that we've got a bit more leverage at subcommittees, not to always say yes to 4 o'clock in the morning, which has been a problem to all of us, I think, has it not? Good, thank you. Are there any other points, therefore, Councillor Jones? That's okay, is it? Okay. If we finish with that section, thank you. We can look therefore at section 9, which is on page 18 of 42, the central area vision that's dealing more with the Basing View area. Would anybody like to say anything on that, ask questions or comments? So we're happy that that's an aspirational thing for when things get going there. Okay, thank you. Moving on then to section 10, dealing with the rural areas, on page 19 of 42. Would anybody like to ask Linda a question or make any comments or suggestions on that? Good, thank you. Shall we take 11 and 12 together? That's exchange of information, human rights, equal opportunity, those 3 sections. Does anybody have any comments to make about any of those? No? I mean, I just have a question of interest, actually. 12.5, you mention the protected characteristics group in the Equality Act. I'm assuming, is that race and disability and that sort of thing? It is, okay. And okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. And sorry, just because I realised I had my microphone on and Linda didn't. She was concurring that it was the race, disability, and 4 other groups, we believe. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. That's an interesting point. Do we need to actually list them, identify them? Because maybe people wouldn't know who belongs to, or what that sort of generic term refers to. So it may be worth adding, or would that be in itself be discriminatory? I don't know.
I think we really just need to demonstrate that we've carried out an equalities impact assessment in line with the Equalities Act. I think it's a step too far to raise awareness of particular groups because it's all in that Act and we're talking about the Licensing Act. We just need to state that we've carried out an impact assessment and there is no negative impacts. In fact, there are positive impacts on children. So I think it's a step too far really to include that.
Just raise one other thing. I wasn't quite sure in paragraph 12.6, it starts by saying, this review concluded that the policy has a generally positive impact on all groups. I wasn't quite sure what that meant, what this review is and exactly what it's saying.
The review is referred to in 12.3. We have to consider all individuals and carry out, I haven't actually said the equality impact statement there, but the review looks at all the particular groups highlighted under the Equality Act, and we have to consider the impact of this policy on those particular mentioned groups, whether there's any negative steps, and we couldn't find anything negative, and generally it's positive because it promotes the use of licensed premises by people, the availability of diversity of a choice to encourage peoples of all race, gender, etc. to be able to come and use licensed premises within Basingstoke. But we've highlighted the fact that there are particularly positive impacts on young people because of the protection of children from harm objectives.
I just simply wonder then if we could just put this review of the Equality Act concluded so that we know what it's talking about. Okay. Thank you. Any other comments on those sections? No? Okay, then we'll move on therefore to compliance and enforcement and delegation. That's sections 13 and 14 on pages 20 and 21. Any comments there or any questions? No? Okay, then we'll move on to perhaps what's most relevant to us, which is consideration of applications. So starting with section 15, new premises licences, that's on page 22 and 23. Would anybody like to comment or ask anything or suggest anything on those? Yes, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. 15.9 at the bottom of 22 of 42, that final sentence that jumps up to the top of the following page, officers will conduct enforcement visits to premises where it is suspected that licensable activities are being provided after a licence is suspended. What triggers a suspicion, and why do we need to have a suspicion before we do an enforcement to make sure it was compliant? I just wondered what happened to all the ones that didn't trigger concern but were nevertheless operating without a licence. I wondered how we captured the ones that haven't been flagged up in some way.
When a licence is suspended, we have to give them 48 hours notice that we're going to suspend the licence because they haven't paid the fee. That in 99% of cases results in the fee being paid. We then follow up a routine with for those that don't pay and therefore can't operate or provide licensable activities. We then would generally do a routine inspection just to check and to make sure they've received the letter, because sometimes the licensee's address is not the premises. It hasn't happened yet that we've found anybody trading while suspended. Generally they've paid the fee or they've closed, like most of them have been late night refreshment premises, so they just close at 11. So because they don't have to have a licence before 11 o'clock. It hasn't arisen yet, but we think there's potential for it to arise, so we wanted to have something in the policy to give them an expectation that we would follow it up.
But that sentence says it would only happen if there was some suspicion about something. I would have thought that it might be add a bit of clarity if we were saying that the officers will go in any case, whether there's some suspicion or not, because it suggests that we would only be prompted by something, and if it wasn't prompted, we wouldn't check it.
Thank you. Good point. Any others on that section about new premises licenses? No? Okay, we'll move on then to section 16, variations to licenses on page 23. Any comments or questions? Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. 16.1, variations to licenses. My question was just, it concludes in that paragraph with a reference to, however, where a variation is so substantial that it significantly changes likely that a new premises license application will be required rather than a variation. I just wonder what the criteria, how is that judged, whether it's a major or a minor, or how, and is it worth including some kind of definition of those, and what would trigger which?
With a minor variation, there was new legislation brought in 2 years ago to allow premises to make minor changes to either their hours or to their activities or to the old conditions that are still on, as long as it was unrelated to alcohol. The officers make a judgment as to whether there's a risk to the promotion of the licensing objectives, and then if it's considered so minor because it's removing a few words or moving the bar around or changing the tables and chairs inside to a different place, that won't impact on the licensing objectives. We can determine that it's a minor variation, and then we decide who to consult out of all the responsible authorities. So if we're not entirely sure, we might just talk to the police or send it to the police. Anything above that would become a major variation, which goes through the standard variation process, which is a higher fee, requires a 28 days consultation, much in the same way as a new premises licence. And then you can get to the stage where people are altering a building so substantially, changing walls, changing the whole layout of the building, or changing the whole nature of the business. Say, suggest it goes from a small bar to become a major restaurant with live music and all the rest of it. That's a whole change to the nature and layout of the business. So the Licensing Act guidance suggests that they should make a new application to reflect the changes to the business, the changes to the building. They can leave the old one running while that's being processed, and then when that's processed, then they can either surrender the old one. They could keep them both running, but that wouldn't be financially viable. So the reason we've shied away from trying to create suggestions or examples is because the range is so broad. We've got applications coming in to take off some of the old public entertainment licences conditions that were transferred over in 2005. We've got some that just want to move a bar. We've got others that want to put something out in the garden. And because the garden's on the plan, it's a minor variation. So if we put examples on, there'll always be other suggestions come out. Well, you haven't suggested that. What do I do in this situation? So we just say to come talk to us first, and we'll give you the guidance.
You're happy with that? It's always nice to have a bit of discretion, isn't it? So that you don't tie yourself down too much. Any other comments on variations of licenses? No? Okay, let's move on now then to section 17 on pages 23 and 24 about new designated premises supervisors. Any questions or comments or suggestions? Nope. Okay, next section 18, transfers of premises licenses on page 24 and 42. Just a short section. Nope. It's fairly straightforward. Not really for us. Okay, provisional statements for premises on section 19, pages 24 and 25. That seems fairly straightforward, doesn't it? Yep. Okay, thank you. Next, we move on to clubs, which we don't deal quite so much with here. And any comments on section 20, which refers to club premises certificates? Speak now or forever and all that? No? Okay. Going home soon. Section 21. Review of premises licenses or club premises certificates. That's on pages 26 and 27. Any comments or questions on that? Nope. Councillor Taylor?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a very quick question, 21.10, where it says all reviews will lead to a hearing before a subcommittee. I just wondered why that was necessary. If there'd been a meeting of minds and issues had been resolved, why did it then have to go on to a subcommittee for it to say, yeah, okay, which is probably what it's going to say. I say that because of the last subcommittee that I was on, that I chaired, and it was like everything had been sorted, everything was agreed, yet it still came to a subcommittee, and I wondered what the value of that was.
The Licensing Act's quite specific in relation to reviews. You have to have a hearing because it's a review. It's identified issues at premises, so you have to have, and that's the Licensing Act doesn't allow for it to be managed any other way.
That's my answer, thank you very much.
I agree with you. We've had them too, where you've really presented with a baked cake, which you'll forgive the mixed metaphor, you have to rubber stamps. Baked cake. Okay, right. Any other questions or comments on that section? No, in that case we'll move on to section 22, removing the mandatory DPS requirement at community premises. Councillor Godison.
Thank you, Chair. 22.2, the Act allows management committees at a community premises to take over the responsibility now that it's no longer necessary to have a DPS. It's where it says the licensing authority will, subject to strong evidence that a community premises is well managed by an experienced committee, support applications. But what would Linda imagine is entailed by strong evidence? What sort of evidence would you require that a village hall committee would be able to adequately run, a license like that? Sorry.
Well, we would need to look at their knowledge and understanding of the Act, particularly in relation to alcohol. We'd need to understand that they were aware of their duties and responsibilities, and that the committee worked cohesively, that you haven't just got one person, because in a lot of these communities, one person tends to do all the work and the rest of the committee are in name only. We'd like to see evidence through committee meetings and minutes that they run as a cohesive community and that they've got backup if one person's not around. There's somebody else who can back up to show the knowledge and understanding of the Act. So it's about a well-managed, well-run committee, and not somewhere where it's generally run one person running around just to keep it all going, because the responsibility for the alcohol sales are very serious and the offences are quite significant, so we'd like to see a really cohesive committee working.
I think he's sort of happy with that. Any other questions on that subject, community premises? No? Right, the next section then, section 23 on page 28, is hearings, very relevant to this committee. So in that first section, 23, when it's talking in general, any comments, please, or any questions? Councillor Frankham.
In the past, when training's come up, there's the standard training we all go on. There were questions whether the chairman of the committee should have extra training to help him. I don't know if that needs. I don't know if it needs to go into policy or if as a group we go something down that road. But
I speak first of all. I think that would be excellent. I think often we find that we've got three fairly inexperienced people turning up, and one of them's got to be a chairman, and they're handed a bit of paper and told to get on with it, and it can be quite difficult. I think it would be a good idea. Whether or not there's a will to do it, I don't know, because it's quite difficult even to get people to go to the training sessions, let alone the extra training sessions to be a chair. But if people would like that, I'm sure we could arrange it. Do you want to say anything?
I just said that I'd support that view, and if we can get the support from the members, we could certainly arrange something. I think we did agree before, but there was some changes in legal which meant that I couldn't deal with the legal officer I needed to. I don't think it's a policy matter though.
Putting it in any policy, we all agreed it would be quite a good idea. Yes. And also, I mean, just to mention while we're talking about hearings, that I obviously very much welcome the fact that we now have a slightly bigger committee. We've got another magistrate in our midst, which is always useful. Somebody of experience, which is always very useful. So please, a wise magistrate, please get to as many training sessions as possible. They tend to be a bit repetitive, but then we need that because we're not dealing with it day in, day out. Any other comments, therefore, on the general subject of hearings? No? Okay, we'll move on then specifically to licence conditions. Any comments on that? Frankham.
In the past, on 12.10, it says the prevention of sale of alcohol to intoxicated customers. I've never seen a proper definition of intoxicated. I did see Portsmouth Police write one a couple of years ago but I just wondered if they'd actually brought a definition. Because one of the problems I see quite regularly if you go out in town, someone will get refused in one premise, they just walk to the next one and get served. So there's no uniformity across the town. So is there any clarification given on that?
No, we've not had any clarification on the definition of intoxication. So I think it's judgment on a case-by-case basis, because licensees can choose who they sell their alcohol to anyway, so they can make the judgment that they believe them to be intoxicated and they don't want to sell to them.
Any other comments on conditions, which are a bit of a bugbear in subcommittees, really? I mean, it's probably worth saying at this stage, having just been through another training session, 3.5 hours, that perhaps the two main things that came across yet again was that when we're making our decisions on either new licenses or variation or reviews, is that the conditions have to be workable and that our reasons have to be exceptionally clear. If we've got workable conditions and clear reasons, we're okay. And we were again encouraged, if we were going to introduce conditions that haven't been offered or haven't been thoroughly investigated in the appeal hearing itself, that if we think of something while we're deciding what to do that hasn't been clearly stated before, that we invite everybody back in again so that we can run them past both the officers and the applicant and make absolutely sure that it's workable. We cover our backs that way to make sure that, and if you're all happy to do that, that would be fine. Councillor Frankham first, then Councillor Taylor.
Just forgive me, I can't remember where it was in the report. It mentioned about what the applicant offers in their application will be converted into conditions, and sometimes they're very poorly written. Will there be guidance at the committee meeting of ones that can't be enforceable? Because in the past we've just plonked them straight in, and some unworkable ones have been put in that way.
Yeah, I think officers are going to look more closely at operating schedules in the future and perhaps reword the wording to make sense before we get to the hearing, and put it in the report that we're suggesting the wording is changed to X, Y or Z. So that would make your lives easier in terms of decision. Just, if I may, while we're on that point, the Institute of Licensing are looking at creating a set of pool of conditions, not a set of standard conditions because we can't have them, but there's a working party on which I sit that we're going to be looking at a national set of conditions for all local authorities to draw on to assist them with making their decisions. So I will update you on that when it happens.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wondered what Linda's thoughts were about applications presented to a subcommittee. A couple of times when I've been on a subcommittee, the application, through negotiation with the police or whoever else, has been completely changed. But we're still presented with the paper that was the original application that bears no resemblance whatsoever to what we're talking about, where we've got to. And that was my point about negotiation, and so why does it come to subcommittee? But I understand what you're saying because it's a legal requirement. But I asked a question in the last subcommittee why we still have the original application from the applicant, and it's just nothing like what they've agreed to. It's nothing like what we are being asked to authorise, and I wondered why we weren't therefore requiring the applicant to submit once they've agreed all the changes and so on. Why aren't we asking them for a subcommittee point of view, ease for a subcommittee, why aren't we asking them to resubmit an application that actually is the accurate document that reflects what they're actually applying for after negotiation? Because you're trying to piece together a whole bundle of things that don't reflect each other at all, and it creates a problem for subcommittees, I think.
The Licensing Act is very good at allowing this opportunity to discuss and mediate with the responsible authorities, which does result in amendments to keep all the parties happy, and often those amendments are made to avoid further objections. So in that case, I think we could probably do more for you in terms of our reports, because we have to show you what came in, which is why you get the original application. We have to show you what's been mediated and what's been agreed, because then you need to decide at the subcommittee, well, yes, we're happy with that, we'll rubber stamp it, or no, actually, we're still not happy, we want to change X, Y, and Z. It still gives you an opportunity, although it's all been mediated and they're happy, you still have the final say. Generally, where it's something that has been changed that has resulted in withdrawal of objections, we will in the future probably just bring it to committee to rubber stamp, so it won't be a formal hearing, it will just be the members of the subcommittee say this has been changed, there were objections, they've been withdrawn, can you rubber stamp it? But certainly on those situations where it's been changing right up to the last day, and I think the last hearing it changed right up to the last day, and because the objector didn't withdraw on time, it had to go to committee. So but I'm sure with your advice or your comments, we can improve what we present to you at licensing subcommittees. We're very happy to do that because it's an evolving process anyway. So if we can look at that definitely to make it easier for you.
Councillor Frankham.
I was only going to mention a previous hearing where we kept adjourning for about 2 hours, but they went out and sorted out the conditions and come back and we just rubber stamped it. Personally, I haven't got a problem with that because everyone away happy. It was quite bizarre sat there in the canteen having a cup of coffee while they were still discussing it. It was a bit unfortunate they left it that late, but if it gets a good result, I'm happy.
While we're on that subject, could I just slightly backtrack because it is actually relevant to what we've just been saying on paragraph 23.5. It says, where mediation is successful and a hearing is deemed unnecessary by all parties, the mediation outcome will be presented to the licensing subcommittee in writing and signed by all parties for ratification and determination. I haven't had that yet, but I'm assuming. But then it says the subcommittee may still determine that the addition of appropriate licence conditions at the determination stage, in view of the fact that we know that we've got to make sure our conditions are properly workable, and we haven't sat and listened to everybody, we haven't had the benefit of a hearing and being able to ask questions and get feedback, etc., it'd be very unlikely that we could really impose conditions having just seen something in writing.
In that situation, if you weren't happy, we'd then say, right, we'll proceed to a hearing, and then we'd set up a future hearing. It gives you the option to say, yeah, we're happy with this, we'll rubber stamp it, or no, we're not happy, we want to have a hearing.
Thank you, that's helpful. Are there any other questions or comments on that section then on hearings? No, conditions, sorry, conditions. If not, we'll now move on to the 4 licensing objectives. The first one being prevention of crime and disorder, which begins at the bottom of page 29 of 42 and goes on from 24.9 to 24.15. Any comments or questions on that, please? I mean, I'd just like to say I do welcome the sort of suggested list of things here that applicants can look at. It gives them ideas of what really doesn't necessarily work, which is, people having to stand up and drink for hours on end because there's no seat, no food, and the music's too loud to do anything but drink, and it's quite nice to have some suggestions for what they could be looking at. Okay, so if there's no other comments except mine, let's move on to public safety, which is the next objective, paragraphs 24.16 to 24.18. Any comments? Oh, except for the typo, which was noted already. Councillor Taylor.
No, I was just going to make reference of the typo because when I pointed that out to my wife and said, well, what am I supposed to do then?
Any other comments? Those who don't know what we're talking about, I'm not going to explain. You should have read it yourselves. Right, let's move on then to the third condition, which is the prevention of public nuisance at paragraphs 24.19 to 24.22. Comments or suggestions, please? Good, we're motoring now. The final one, protection of children from harm, at paragraphs 24.23 to 24.27. I've just got one suggestion to make. The final one, 24.27, doesn't actually specifically refer to the protection of children from harm. It refers to all licensing objectives. It says, in respect of all licensing objectives, licensing officers may be asked to assist in the drafting of license conditions, etc. And I wondered if that should be moved back to near 23.8 when we're actually talking about that. Is that okay? So around 23.8, yes. Thank you very much. Any other comments on that one? Councillor Taylor.
Just to jump back on 24.26, about the licensing authority would expect to see the relevant box on an application form completed to specify none. And I just wondered what happens if not?
If there's nothing in the box, we make an assumption that they're not going to have any matters that give rise. There's a particular box on the application form that talks about adult entertainment and that sort of thing. And if they say none, we put it on the licence. Because then if it's on the licence, they can't have the 11 exempt events under the sexual entertainment venues. So if they don't put anything in there, we assume that they mean none. So we put that on the licence. It makes it very clear.
Any other comments on the protection of children from harm section? No? Okay, let's move on then to personal licences, section 25, pages 33 and 34. Any comments on that? Councillor Taylor.
I'll stop soon. 25.4, I just wondered, the references to the one licensing objective, crime and disorder. I wonder why all four aren't included in that paragraph.
It goes back to the Licensing Act. Police can only object under the crime and disorder objective against personal licence applicants.
Thank you very much.
Could I just ask one question? I notice in two of the paragraphs in this section, 25.6 and then again in 25.8, it says the licensing authority expects all personal licence holders to advise at each time there's a change of name and address as required under the Act. And also the licensing authority expects personal licence holders to undertake their duty to disclose any convictions. Would a better word be requires? I think it just sounds a little bit more definite, doesn't it? That you actually require them to do it. You're not asking them, you're kind of telling them. Does that make sense? Would you be prepared? See if you're allowed to.
I'll just check the legal position on that, and then if we can, I'll put it as requires.
Right, if there are no other comments on that section, we'll move to temporary events, section 26, pages 34 and 35. Any comments on temporary events? I think I've just got two comments. One is just a little grammatical thing. In 26.1, right at the beginning, it says the Licensing Act makes provision for the authorisation of a person. Don't think you also, yes, you. And the other one is the same as before, 26.2, third line down. The licensing authority expects the premises user to have advised those residents and businesses. If you could just, okay, so that is supposed to be more woolly. I wondered if it was. Okay, that's fine. Any other comments on temporary events? I'm assuming you haven't got a lot to say either about online applications. It's really an administrative thing, is it not? Yes, thank you. Let's move on then to the final section, other relevant matters. First of all, adult entertainments, paragraphs 21.8 to 28.1 to 28.5. Any comments on that section? Obviously bearing in mind that we do have a separate sex establishment policy when it's needed. Everyone happy with that? Yep. Okay. Gaming machines, paragraphs 28.6 to 28.12. These are the gaming machines that you're allowed in these premises. Comments or questions? just comment once again, it's another use of the word expected in 28.9. The second sentence says, the applicant will be expected to satisfy the authority that there will be sufficient measures to ensure that minors do not have access to the adult-only gaming machine. I think we really could require there. Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
So I was going to agree entirely with that, because we've got to require further down, and I wondered why there was a distinction between expecting and requiring. I think we just need to strengthen it with a requirement rather than expectation.
Come to the last section. We're nearly there. Outdoor seating, paragraphs 28.13 to 28.15. Except for, I may as well say it up front, 28.15 says, licences will be expected to make appropriate arrangements for customers who wish to smoke outside the premises. Could you check if we can put require? Or is that, once again, you want to be a little bit less definite on that one?
I can't find any legislation that allows us to require it.
Councillor Burgess has just queried on 28.11, previous one. Does gambling in alcohol on licensed premises? I think it's just on licence instead of off licence, I think, yes. Sorry?
Game.
Oh, gaming as opposed to gambling. Any comments on that? Is that correct?
I've used the word gambling because it relates to things like poker and that sort of thing, which is more of a familiar term, but under the Act it's referred to as gaming. I can change it if you prefer.
Okay, well, that's the end of the actual policy. Unless anybody wants to make any comment on the Appendix B, which is a table of delegation of functions for decision-making under the Licensing Act, which is just obviously for our information. So unless you spot a mistake there, I think we'd be happy with that. Are there any other things that are not included that you think should be included in this licensing policy? Councillor Taylor.
Can I just make the point, Chairman, that I think this is an excellent document. It's a huge improvement on the previous one. I know we've had things to say, and that's the purpose of it being here, but I think it's an excellent piece of work, and I think it's going to take us forward really successfully. Thank you.
I've just got one thing that I'd like to run past you. Sorry. Oh yes, please minute that. I think we're all agreed it is an excellent policy, is it not? I'm really, it read well and it's very comprehensive. I think it's going to be tremendously helpful to us in our subcommittee, so thank you very much for that. Yes, I wonder how you would feel about us having some say in being allowed as an authority to, if there's a film that comes to one of our cinemas, to actually have the authority to say we don't feel that this is appropriate for this area. At the moment, all films that come to cinemas, obviously most of them have some classification by the British Board of Film Classification, and the other people who make the decision are the film companies, the cinema companies, etc. My view is that just on an odd occasion, and I can't think of what it could be at the moment, but who knows, there might be a gross film that we, as the elected representatives, feel are not suitable for our area. And I would tend to feel that we are better placed to know that than some faceless bodies elsewhere who are saying this is right or this is wrong. For instance, I know some authorities do actually have something in their policies that allow them to do this. Hardly ever used, of course. I mean, what we don't want is disgusted at Basingstoke saying, oh, we can't have Batman, it's too scary. But just occasionally there is something really gross, and if, for instance, you live in an area with a very high Muslim community, and there is some really gross film that shows severe violence to Muslims, you might be able to say, actually, we don't feel that that's going to be helpful in our authority. And I'm just asking the question, would you have on the back burner, as it were, and hardly ever use, but if it's there, it's there, have some clause which allows us to intervene if we feel it's necessary. And I would ask, do we actually have to have such a clause, or could we call on our powers in any case if we feel that there is something that is just not going to be right for our area?
In my own experience, the only time we've been called upon to look at the classification of a film is when a cinema is asked to lower the film classification to what the BBRC have put on it. I don't know what powers we've got in terms of preventing films from being shown, whether it's through pressure or whatever, but I'm certainly going to look into that for you, and I can put something together, and if it's appropriate for the policy and you want it put in there, we can put it in there and consult on it. I can definitely look into that with help from my legal advisor here. Yep.
I would just ask how you'd feel about that. I'm talking about some extenuating circumstances that I've never thought of. I mean, obviously, we would not, in general, interfere, and I have to be clear on that. But if I could just read out something that I've sort of joined together from a couple of other authorities' policy statements that I feel could be appropriate. Something like, in exceptional cases in which the licensing authority deems that a film, whether BBFC classified or unclassified, is likely to cause harm to any section of the public or lead to disorder and or stir up hatred or incite violence towards any section of the public, the licensing authority may decide that the film may not be shown. Its decision shall be final in that respect. Comments, please. Councillor Barnes.
I was just going to say, who would make the judgment? Would it be a collective judgment? We'd all have to get together, all of us. Or would it be, say, yourself, for instance? Or how would we make this particular judgment? Thank you.
Since it's my idea, I better answer that. My view would be that we would have to call an extraordinary meeting of the committee so that we could decide it together. And if it was really, really contentious, it would have to go to council, but, you know, obviously. Yes, Councillor.
But we would have to have some evidence of that, wouldn't we? But if you get what I'm saying. Thank you.
You're quite right. It could be that those who make the decision would have to have seen the film. We can't just go on what people say. Thank you. Councillor Godison.
Thank you, Chair. Well, the only comment I would make is that there's a danger if the public became aware that we had this right, that we'd be inundated with all sorts of applications from strange people who objected to violence of any kind or sexual matters of any kind, or etc., and it could be quite difficult. I mean, a case in which there is, for instance, extreme provocation to an ethnic group or anything like that, presumably there would be the power to insist that that film doesn't take place on purely racist grounds.
I'm just wondering whether the cinema would be committing some offences by showing it. We're going to have to do some legal research on this before we conclude, I think, so we'll make sure we get some research done on that.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that's the point for me. Censorship is a really, really delicate area, and to draw some opinions spontaneously, which is what it is at the minute. I'm sitting here as a responsible adult as well as a borough councillor, and I will be very twitchy about that level of censorship over and above what exists sort of nationally, if you like. But I take your point that we do have a responsibility. I just don't know how far we should take that responsibility to the point where we're making decisions for other people as to what is or is not good. That would be my view. But I think I would welcome the officers kind of working up something that informs us as to what would work, if it would at all.
Thank you. Oh, Councillor Godison.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to make the comment that I would have thought it was much more relevant to have some sort of rule on these matters where, you know, private clubs or pubs or whatever intended to show some sort of films which might well overstep the mark. I mean, I think I would have imagined that cinemas, etc., would be exercising their own restraint about what they do or don't show. But private clubs that might well be wish to show films which the rest of us might deem to be completely unsavoury, and, you know. But quite how you would police that, I wouldn't know. Sorry.
Just as an aside, if the private clubs have a club premises certificate, there is a mandatory condition on there that says they must comply with the British Board of Film classification when showing films. So there is already a mandatory condition in relation to the films they're showing. If they're showing adult films of an adult nature, then they technically become a sex cinema, so they'll be subject to the provisions of the Sex Establishments Act.
Mr. Frankham.
I think it's worth investigating. One of the concerns I've got though is I've already seen some pretty horrific things in different fields, and it's had an effect on me. If we then have to sit and watch the film, what about it does to us? You know, yeah. I've seen someone fall to their death. That was, you know, I didn't sleep for days because it was horrific. They laid there for hours before someone realised they were there, because I saw it back on CCTV. So I'd be concerned on the effect on the people that watch it. So you've got to be careful of. So you've got that factor to look at as well.
I entirely agree with you. This is the big problem, isn't it? I mean, who'd want to sit on the British Board of Film Classification, have to look through some of the stuff they have to look through, but there we go. Anyway, we're all agreed that it would be a good idea to at least investigate it so that we know the grounds on which we stand. Okay, so just looking then at the recommendations, we are happy therefore all to recommend approval of the draft statement of licensing with the amendments and etc. that we have given to Linda. Agreed? For consultation. And secondly, we have also been asked to recommend that the head of governance is authorised to make necessary amendments to the policy as a result of legislative or other changes that do not impact on the promotion of the licensing objectives. If anything just comes along, that can be adjusted. Yes, all agreed on that? Thank you. I think therefore that finishes the licensing policy side of things. We just therefore do the last subject on the agenda, which is just to comment on the matters dealt with by subcommittee. You have got the papers at the back anyway, so you know exactly what they are. There have been 4 cases since the last meeting. Just in summary, the Laverstoke Park review, particularly with regard to Carfest, 3 extra conditions were imposed, restricting the length of events, restricting the distance between housing and live music stages, and ensuring that light nuisance is limited. Bang Bar application for new DPS was rejected. I believe there might be another one now, is there or not? Yeah. Licence to sell alcohol at the new B&M store on Worting Road was granted with conditions, most particularly that the amount of floor space given to the alcohol sales and the position at the rear of the store. And finally, the application for a premises licence at the Coronation Arms at Marybourne was granted with conditions. Okay. Councillor Taylor.
This really is my final point. Thank you, Chairman. The subcommittee on the 31st of May and the subcommittee on the 5th of July, in their conditions, they've got, I just want, it's a plea for consistency really. Point 6 on the 31st of May refers to, you know, CCTV to be retained for a minimum of 31 days. The Coronation Arms one says 28 days, and I wondered whether we ought to be saying the same length of time, whether it's 28 or 31, it doesn't matter, but we need to be saying the same thing.
That's a good point. We're going to investigate conditions, are we not, and try and make it, as we said earlier, that's a good point though. Yes, we do want consistency. Councillor Frankham.
On the B&M stores, they offer 31 days because it's quite unusual. Normally it's 28 or 30 days. So it was purely down because that's what they offered. So that's why you're getting the inconsistencies. So it would have to go back further to the point when the pre-applications that we would look for this amount of days. And it depends on the system as well. My CCC system, you can adjust it up to 30 days.
Thank you. That's a good point, though. I mean, we could have said 28 days and been consistent ourselves, couldn't we? But thank you. Yes, that's a good point. And it just flag up the fact that we do need to just hitch up a little bit on our conditions and the way we word them. So that's the end of the meeting. Thank you very much.